Hello and welcome back to another update. It is your host Weeb Union, and we start out with the newest update on the Russo-Ukrainian war in the direction of Novomikhailivka, where the Russians have made an advance to the north of the town. They have advanced along the road, allowing them to gain control over the roads between Novomikhailivka and the north, as well as the first line parallel to it. This allows the Russians to now strengthen their positions to the north of Novomikhailivka. We'll likely see the Russians push further westwards to gain control over the forest line to the north of this, and in the western direction to gain control over the road to the north of the town. This will allow the Russians to hold the flank west of the road to then resupply and strengthen their offensive operations in the direction of Novomikhailivka. This advance was confirmed with this new location. With this, the Russians are continuously developing the offensive operation here in the direction of Novomikhailivka. In the first week of the month of April, the Russians have gained control of the heights and fortifications to the south of the town, and now two advances to the north of the town, with the Russians also gaining control over half of the Dacha area, which is vacation home area. And then here in the central parts of Novomikhailivka, the Russians have started pushing to the western parts. This indicates a slow end to the Battle of Novomikhailivka, as the Russians are nearing their final battle of it. Moving further north, we see here in the direction of Pervomaisk to the north of the town, the Russians are developing their offensive operations towards the Ukrainian fortifications in the area. They are going to be attacking it from multiple directions. They already have a foothold in the eastern parts of it. With them pushing in the northern direction, they can now move in a southern direction, this road west of Tonenke, to push through towards the fortifications from the north, east, and now also from the south. The Russians are pushing both in the eastern parts here north of Pervomaisk, as well as in the western parts, where they'll be attacking the fortifications. This maneuvering is to allow the Russians to gain their biggest possible advantage, while attacking it from multiple directions will allow them to overrun the Ukrainian positions. Attacking it everywhere at the same time will prevent the Ukrainians from simply hopping between the fortifications and fall back bit by bit. Instead, they will have to fully man their fortifications all throughout the area where they are located. This will allow the Russians to push them all at the same time. With the large numbers Russians have available in this section of the front line, they'll look to completely push the Ukrainians out of these fortifications, which will adjust the front line here to the east of the road, east of Yasnobrodivka, as well as allow the Russians to start attacking the village of Umanske or crossing the river line to the north. It could also allow the Russians to start pushing towards Netailove from the northern direction. All in all, this is to improve the tactical situation for the Russians and their positioning north of Pervomaisk, south of Umanske, to then develop the situation further to start assaults towards the three villages of Umanske, Yasnobrodivka, and Netailove. In the northern direction by Novokalinovo, we see that the Russians have made an advance north of the railway. This is to gain a foothold in the village of Novokalinovo, which is one that is very wide. We have two sections of the village. We have the western section near the heavily fortified area of Ocheretine, and they have the eastern section, which is fairly isolated. And this is why the Russians are launching attacks towards the eastern section. From the bottom area here, where the Russians are attacking from, we see that the Ukrainian village is not very wide, which allows the Russians to push through and towards it without having a wide front to fight through. At the same time, the Russians have managed to gain control over the western parts of the lake, which allows them to strengthen their flank here to the west. This will allow the Russians to then push in the northern direction, gain the foothold, and will likely also push in the eastern direction by the forest line here to secure the eastern flank as well. This will allow the Russians to gain a foothold within the village and push through it. By gaining control over Novokalinovo by slowly pushing through the eastern parts, this will likely be a long battle, as the Ukrainians have heavily fortified their positions in the area. But if they manage to gain control over Novokalinovo, then the Battle of Ocheretine can begin, as the Russians will have two directions to push towards the Ukrainian positions. They will also likely continue fighting in the Berdishi direction to then add a third direction as well, as the Russians would be able to attack through the railways in the central parts, Berdishi in the western parts, and Novokalinovo in the eastern parts. To attack Ocheretine from all of these three directions is necessary by the Russians, because Ocheretine is heavily fortified, located on the hills It is the most heavily fortified area in the entirety of the west of Avdiivka, all the way to the Pokrovsk defensive line. The Ocheritina area, as we can see, have fortifications, heavily fortified areas, both to the north, east, south, and west of the village. At the same time, it is located on the hills, and it is a main train supply hub for the Ukrainians. If the Russians gain control over Ocheritina, they can start using Avdiivka as a supply hub and move it in the northern direction towards Ocheritina, to then develop offensive operations towards Pokrovsk to the west. This, combined with the control over Pervomaisky, would allow them to push in the southern parts as well. And moving further south, it also connects with the Marinka direction. All of these three directions to push towards Pokrovsk from three separate directions. It seems that 3 is the magical number for the Russians, as they are looking to attack from three separate directions in pretty much every single occasion. Similar here, it is also important to capture Novokalinova by the Russians to push further northwards towards Konstantinivka. We see here by the road, if the Russians capture Novokalinova and Keramik, they'll be able to secure every single village between Ocheritina and the road here, which will allow the Russians to secure the western flank to start pushing in the eastern direction, both against Alexandropol and in the direction of New York, which would allow the Russians to start developing an offensive operation towards the north. The Russians have a significant amount of soldiers right now available, and the Ukrainians have all of their own committed to the front line, which means that the more fighting goes on, the faster this battle of attrition will end, as the more the attrition will take place. And when one side has a large enough advantage, as the Russians currently do, with a significant firepower, air power, and manpower advantage, the Russians would simply out-attrition the Ukrainians, unless the Ukrainians simply have such a good strategy that they overcome all of these difficulties, which so far does not seem to be the case, considering the Russian advantage is just growing with time. To the west of Bakhmut, we also see some Russian advances. In the direction of Bohdanivka, the Russians have captured the most significant part of the village, and only 10% of the village is left. It is pretty much just one single street that is left. This means that the Russian operation towards Bohdanivka is closing on its end, and with this, the Russians will start to develop in the direction of Kalinina. And as I said previously, the Russians are unlikely to advance further within the eastern parts of Chasiv Yar, but will instead focus on the flanks. And this leads us to the south of Bohdanivka and south of Chasiv Yar. We see that there is this small advance by the Russians, but this is an indication that the Russians are starting to attack the fortifications to the south of Bohdanivka and Chasiv Yar and towards the forest line here. If the Russians manage to gain control over the forest line and Kalinina to the north, the Russians will start their offensive operations across the canal line to gain access to the western bank. This is by going through the forest areas, where we see that there are some natural crossings across the canal. This will allow the Russians to establish a bridgehead across and then start assaulting and attacking the Ukrainian fortifications on the other side and establish supply lines across. This would allow the Russians to start developing their offensive operations towards Chasiv Yar, but it's likely that they will focus on the bridgehead, expanding it and gaining full control of it before launching any significant push towards Chasiv Yar itself. It is also likely that the Russians will focus on gaining control over the southern and northern flanks of Bakhmut before that, as the Russians will look to gain control over Hrivovka, Klishchivka, and Andreyivka as well. This will allow the Russians to securely have control over the western flank, which is of Bakhmut by the canal line, and with that, establishing positions across the canal with these bridgeheads will allow them to then start storming Chasiv Yar from three separate directions. And again, looking on the grander scale of things, three separate directions towards Konstantinivka itself, from the Bakhmut direction, from the Horlivka direction, and from the Avdiivka direction. In the direction of Bilorivka, we also see here that the Russians have made an advancement parallel to the chalk hill here to the south of Bilorivka. The Russians are slowly developing the offensive operation towards Bilorivka with small advances here and there. However, there's no significant advances by the Russians, and their fighting is still outside of the village. Over the past 24 hours, the Russians have managed to successfully develop their offensive operations across the front. It's likely that the Russians have intensified their offensive operations in areas other than Chasiv Yar itself, as the Ukrainians responded to the Russian assaults towards Chasiv Yar by sending reinforcements to the area, and the Russians are trying to take advantage of that by attacking the other areas where the Ukrainians have reduced their own presence. And that is going to be all for this update. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content, and have a great day.